My dad superglued my retainer to my teeth, and the dentist couldn't believe what she saw when I opened my mouth. I took my retainer out at dinner on a Tuesday night because it was digging into my gums, and I set it on the table next to my plate. My dad looked at it and looked at me and picked it up without a word and walked to the garage and came back holding a tube of superglue. "Open your mouth," he said. He pressed the retainer back against my teeth and squeezed glue along the edges and held it in place with his thumb for 30 seconds while the glue set, and I could feel it oozing onto my gums and the roof of my mouth, and it burned like someone had poured hot sauce on raw skin. I gagged from the chemical taste and the burning. "Stop being dramatic, it's just glue," he said. That night I locked myself in the bathroom and tried to pry the retainer off with my fingernails, and it didn't move at all, and pulling on it made my gums bleed, and the pain shot through my jaw so hard my eyes watered. Something felt wrong against the roof of my mouth, like the retainer wasn't sitting flat against the tissue like it normally did. There was a hard lump between the retainer and the roof of my mouth that I could feel with my tongue, and I figured it was a glob of dried glue that would dissolve on its own. The next morning I tried to eat a bowl of cereal, and I couldn't open my jaw wide enough to fit the spoon in my mouth, and chewing sent a bolt of pain through my entire head, so I poured it out and drank a smoothie instead. My dad watched me drink it. "Good, maybe now you'll learn to appreciate what things cost," he said. I put the glass down. "Dad, you glued a piece of metal to my teeth with superglue? This is not normal," I said. "You know what's not normal? A kid who can't follow one simple rule about keeping her retainer in," he said. "My mouth is burning and I need to see a dentist," I said. "You're not wasting my money on a dentist because you can't handle a little discomfort," he said. "This isn't discomfort. I can taste chemicals every time I swallow and my gums are bleeding," I said. "It'll stop once it sets," he said. And he left for work, and I stood in the kitchen with the taste of superglue and blood in my mouth. It didn't stop, and it didn't get better. A week in, and the pain was constant from the moment I woke up to the moment I finally fell asleep. And even then, I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my jaw throbbing so deep it felt like someone was squeezing my skull in a vice. My gums ached all day and pulsed all night, and I couldn't sleep on my side because any pressure on my jaw made the pain spike into my ear and behind my eye. I couldn't brush my teeth properly because the retainer was cemented over them, and the bristles couldn't reach behind the wire. And my breath was getting bad enough that I started holding my hand over my mouth when I talked to anyone. I stopped smiling at school because opening my lips too far pulled on the swollen gums, and the pain made me flinch, and people started asking me why I looked so serious all the time. "Are you okay?" a girl in my English class asked. "Yeah, just tired," I said, and she didn't ask again. I started eating lunch alone in a back corner of the library because I didn't want anyone to see me struggling to drink a smoothie through a straw while everyone else ate normal food. The taste in my mouth was metallic and wrong every single hour of. Every single day, like I was sucking on a penny that had been soaking in something rotten, and no amount of mouthwash could cover it. I showed my dad the swelling one night after dinner, and opened my mouth as wide as I could and pointed at my gums. "Rinse with salt water," he said. I rinsed with salt water, and it burned so badly I cried into the sink with my hands gripping the porcelain, and spit out a mouthful of pink, and my dad was in the other room watching TV like nothing was happening. I tried to call my mom, who lived in another state, and I got as far as, "Mom, Dad glued my retainer to my," before my dad walked into the room and took the phone out of my hand. "You're not dragging your mother into this," he said. "Into what? Into the fact that you glued my mouth shut with superglue?" I asked. "Go to your room," he said, and that was the end of it. The hard lump on the roof of my mouth was still there, and it pressed against my tongue every time I swallowed, and I pushed my tongue against it 20 times a day, trying to figure out what it was, because it didn't feel like dried glue anymore. It was flat and rectangular and had edges. I could feel through the tissue, and it sat right behind my front teeth where the retainer pressed tightest against the roof of my mouth. I walked into the living room one night and stood in front of my dad and opened my mouth and pointed up at the hard lump pressing against the roof of my mouth. "There's something under the retainer that shouldn't be there. I can feel it with my tongue every time I swallow," I said. "It's glue residue. Stop playing with it with your tongue," he said, and he wouldn't look at me when he said it. He stared at the TV and his leg bounced against the couch, and that was the first time I noticed him do that whenever I brought up the retainer. 2 weeks in, and I could barely open my mouth wide enough to fit a straw between my teeth. I'd lost almost 8 pounds because I couldn't eat anything that required chewing, and I was living on smoothies and broth and applesauce, and even the applesauce hurt because moving my tongue to swallow pushed against the swelling. My jeans were loose on my hips, and my face looked different in the mirror, and my dad never once asked me why I was losing weight. I stopped talking at school entirely because forming words pulled on my gums, and the pain made my eyes water mid-sentence, and my voice came out muffled and wrong like I was talking through a wall. My friends thought I was mad at them because I wouldn't talk and I wouldn't explain why, and one by one they stopped sitting with me at lunch until nobody sat with me at all. A boy I liked tried to talk to me in the hallway between third and fourth period, and I just shook my head and walked away because I couldn't open my mouth wide enough to explain why I couldn't open my mouth, and the look on his face when I walked away from him made me cry in the bathroom for 10 minutes. My grades were dropping because I couldn't participate in class discussions, and my history teacher marked me down 3-letter grades in 1 week for not answering when called on, and I sat there every time with my mouth closed while the class waited, and the teacher stared at me, and I couldn't say a single word. Every class period I sat pressing my tongue against the roof of my mouth trying to understand why there was a hard rectangular shape behind my retainer that didn't feel like anything. That should be inside a human mouth. My best friend cornered me in the bathroom after school on a Thursday. "You have to tell me what's wrong because you haven't talked in 4 days and I'm scared," she said, and I opened my mouth just wide enough for her to see the swelling, and she covered her own mouth with her hand, and her eyes filled up. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, and I closed my mouth and shook my head. The next morning, my English teacher noticed I hadn't spoken in class for nearly a week and pulled me aside after the bell, and I couldn't answer her questions, so she walked me to the school nurse herself. The nurse asked me to open my mouth, and I opened it as far as I could, which was barely an inch, and the nurse looked inside and went very quiet, and then she stood up slowly and picked up the phone on her desk without saying a word to me. Emergency dental appointment that afternoon. My dad had to drive me because the school called him directly and told him I needed immediate dental care, and he couldn't say no without raising questions he didn't want to answer. He was quiet the entire drive over, and he gripped the steering wheel with both hands and didn't look at me once. He sat in the waiting room scrolling his phone and bouncing his knee like he was annoyed about missing work, but I could see his jaw clenching every time someone walked past him. The dentist numbed my mouth as much as the swelling would allow and spent 30 minutes working a chemical solvent along the edges of the retainer, dissolving the glue millimeter by millimeter, because it had bonded to the enamel and pulling too fast would crack my teeth. I lay in the chair gripping the armrest with my eyes closed while she worked, and I could feel the retainer loosening in tiny increments, and each one sent a fresh wave of pain through my jaw and up into my temples. The retainer finally separated from the roof of my mouth, and something fell onto my tongue that wasn't glue and wasn't metal. It was soft and damp and flat, and my tongue pushed it forward instinctively, and the dental assistant caught it with forceps before I could spit it out. She held it under the overhead light, and it was a small folded piece of paper that had been pressed between the retainer and the roof of my mouth for 2 weeks. The dentist took it from the forceps and unfolded it carefully, and the paper was soft and partially dissolved at the edges, but the print in the center was still legible. She read it, and her hands stopped moving, and she looked at me, and she looked at the paper again, and then she turned and looked through the open doorway at my dad sitting in the waiting room. It was a jury summons addressed to my father with a report date that had already passed. I turned my head in the chair and looked at my dad through the doorway, and he looked up from his phone and saw the paper in the dentist's hand, and he was out of his chair and coming down the hallway before I could blink. He shoved past the dental assistant so hard she stumbled into the wall, and he reached for the paper, and the dentist pulled it behind her back, and he grabbed at her arm and knocked the instrument tray off the counter, and it crashed across the floor, scattering tools everywhere, and he was trying to get around her, reaching for a wet piece of paper that just came out of his daughter's mouth. The dental assistant screamed, and I pressed myself back into the chair, and 11. The receptionist in the front was already on the phone with 911. My dad got his hand on the dentist's wrist, and she yanked it free and backed into the corner, holding the summons behind her, and he lunged for it again, and 2 dental hygienists came running in from the next room and grabbed him by both arms and pinned him against the wall, and he was struggling and yelling, "Give me the paper!" And they held him there with his face against the drywall until the cops walked in 8 minutes later and found a grown man being restrained by 2 women in scrubs over a jury summons that had been hidden inside his teenage daughter's mouth. He got charged with contempt of court for the summons and child abuse for the glue.